recently completed your new book, Slowdown, and I'd describe you as the man who sounded the trumpet at the walls of Jericho. In the book, you document a convincing dossier of evidence to support the idea that we are living in an era of deceleration. Can I invite you first to summarise some of this evidence?
The strongest evidence for this is that I wasn't looking for it. I was actually looking for things that were speeding up, because we know people are very excited about the idea of acceleration. So I thought, I'll just look at lots of global data sets and I'll find out what's speeding up. The evidence is that I could find hardly anything speeding up. And lots of things are still going up. Average GDP in the world is going up, life expectancy is going up, the average, well, actually the average height of people isn't going up, but hardly anything is accelerating. In fact, to make my point, there are just 4 things accelerating of the main global data sets. They are the number of, 4 things that were accelerating until March 2020. Number of graduates worldwide going to university, the amount of carbon that we were polluting the atmosphere with, the number of air flights we were taking, some of us, but overall they were accelerating in total, and the temperature of the planet was not just rising but accelerating. Everything else I could measure was slowing.
Thank you. The subtitle of the book is The End of the Great Acceleration and Why It's Good for the Planet, for the Economy and Our Lives. A message that I took away from the book was that that this era of deceleration presents a unique opportunity for societies to stabilise their economies, decrease inequality and call for a moratorium on environmental change. Would you like to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, one problem is that we tend to think of increases and even acceleration as a good thing, or because it's something that our parents and grandparents were used to. They were used to technological acceleration, invention after invention after invention, things becoming possible that weren't even imagined before. They were used to the material conditions of life, not just improving, but improving at a speed that was actually an acceleration. However, it is patently obvious that accelerations are temporary things. They cannot carry on forever. But nevertheless, governments have had targets such as a 2% growth in GDP every year, which of course, if it were to occur, would be a larger growth each year than the year before, because it would be 2% of something that had grown. Everything has to stop accelerating at some point. It looks as if much of human life on the planet now, although still at a great speed, is not accelerating as it was, and that can give you hope for the future. And I wanted to emphasize this because in particular my younger students, these are undergraduates, 18, 19, 20, a lot of them really do think it's game over environmentally, think it's game over in terms of out of control capitalism and so on. But observing a slowdown, I think, can give you hope for the future.
Thanks. And when I was a young lecturer, I read James Gluck's book, Faster, The Acceleration of Just About Everything. And Gluck suggests, if I remember rightly, that everything from our money to our personal relationships will just move faster and faster, especially for the millennials, I guess, or people you might call Generation Y. But 2 decades later, your work sort of forensically dismantles this thesis.
It does. It was, I mean, he was writing some time ago. But looking at it now, and it's much easier now, you can see that, for instance, the population acceleration of the planet, that ended around about 1968. GDP began to decelerate, still rising, but decelerate in the 1950s. The number of relationships people have has almost certainly decelerated compared to what they got up to before. And it's difficult to persuade people of this. Not least because we work in universities, and part of the stock in trading universities, particularly the science and medical side, is to say, look at us, we're inventing more new things than ever before, we're inventing more cures, aren't we great? But actually, the really big medical interventions have been done. The Human Genome Project is great, but it's not going to be a panacea. It tells you that chance is much more important than we thought in terms of our lives. And when it comes to science, science isn't going to give us what science fiction said it would. It isn't going to give us teleportation. It isn't going to give us the kind of promises that we were given as children. Whereas for our parents and grandparents, it did. It took people to the moon. That kind of thing is coming to an end. It's not an end of history. it's an end of material expansion of the kind that we've been used to. It doesn't mean that we won't get great change in future. I end the book talking about great social changes, but the idea that our children will live radically different material lives to us is, I think, wrong.
Okay. So, yeah, so to what extent would you say then that the idea of slowdown is sort of countercultural? Because we've lived in a world of sort of endless economic growth, and this is assumed to be very essential for our kinds of society.
It is. I do find it odd. I think it must be that now is the time that this becomes more obvious. It's not me. It's a time of this. Because if you look at economic growth, the 1960s had slower growth than the 50s, the 70s slower than the 60s, the 80s slower than the 70s, and so on and so on, every decade till now. But each time we blame something like the oil shock in the 70s or the recession of the 80s or the crash of 2008. We blamed an individual event rather than saying actually the long-term progress is towards the slowdown. So we've had something get into our brains that said that speeding up is normal. I did look, of course, as you do as an academic, I looked at other people's work.
Yeah.
And I looked at books, more recent books about acceleration. And my favourite one was one which talked a great deal about theories of acceleration, but didn't have any empirical evidence until it came to the first piece of evidence I think it's cited in the book. There were two. One was the speed at which films were being cut and the average frame length. And the second one, which of course isn't speeding up now, but did in the past. And the second one was the speed at which politicians in the Norwegian parliament spoke. Right. Now, if you're having to use that as your example of empirical evidence that the world is speeding up, you really are clutching at straws.
Yeah, that's it's great. And I remember in the book you used the imagery of the brakes being applied to a speeding train, and I quite like that idea. What sort of gave you that sort of put you onto that particular analogy?
Well, okay, it does two things. One is the train is still going forward. Even when the brakes are on, the train is still going forward. Just as GDP is still rising worldwide, population is still rising worldwide. So you've got to understand, the brakes being on doesn't mean that you're going backwards. You're still going forward, but you're slowing down. Yeah. The second thing, and really important, and you can almost feel it. I can feel it because, you've been in the car with the brakes on. Yeah. You know what it feels like when the brakes go on. You're still going forward, but your body goes backwards. Yeah. And if you brake too fast, your body goes forward and you feel dislocated. Whereas when you were speeding, I mean, again, think about it in a plane crossing the Atlantic. When you're speeding across the Atlantic in a plane, you feel still. It feels normal. It's the slowing down that feels abnormal, even though what is normal is to be still. So it was trying to use our bodies and our sense and to explain how we got so used to speed.
Yeah, well, it's very good. So can I ask you about a couple of very specific parts of the book? I hadn't considered the slowdown in the growth of Wikipedia pages, so I thought that was quite a sort of thing. I just imagined it was continuing. So I think that was quite an illuminating small nugget. But so maybe you could mention that. But also in your book, you point to some of the pay cuts of the FTSE 100 companies, where I know you've previously written and investigated and written a lot about high-paid jobs, especially elite jobs. What are your current views?
Okay, well, on Wikipedia, this was looking for the slowdown in the growth of big data. People say there's more data created every second than the second before. I thought I'd look for data which was useful, as opposed to kind of the enormous rubbish we're collecting of data. And it may be sacrilege in academia to say, but I think Wikipedia is the single most useful thing on the internet. Collectively produced, collectively edited. Hopefully, it'll carry on being improved. One thing that makes me think it will carry on being improved is, as I think about 8 years after it was created, the speed at which it grew began to slow. And then there was a little jump in 2015 when people created a thing called stubs, where you could do sub-definitions of it. But again, it slowed. Why did it slow? Despite the fact that there are growing numbers of nerds around the world who will happily edit Wikipedia pages. It didn't slow because of a lack of nerds. It slowed because of a lack of things that needed an explanation that anybody was ever going to look up. There was a limited amount of knowledge. We don't suddenly create more knowledge.
Yeah.
Suddenly we create more knowledge, but not to this enormous accelerating rate.
Yeah.
Just because more of us are looking. Secondly, you ask about pay. I've been looking at inequality for about 20, maybe 30 years. And mainly I began looking because it was rising in the 80s in Britain when I was first studying. Recently, last 5-6 years, inequality in pay in the majority of OECD countries has fallen slightly. Most of the world has fallen slightly. It's not very fashionable to say it, but for somebody who goes on and on about income inequality and how bad it is, I think we have to notice when the falls do begin to happen, and they have, and they've begun to occur before the pandemic was even known. That's quite important.
Yeah. So you finished the manuscript for Slowdown, and I sort of wonder. Well, I was going to say you finished it BC, i.e., before COVID. Can I ask you to speculate on how you might have concluded if the deadline had been a year later, or even 18 months later, in the sort of AC period, the sort of after COVID period?
I can tell you that because the publisher just yesterday said they're going to do a paperback and it will come out at the start of 2021. And can I do a preface about COVID? So well, I've only had a day to think about it. So, I mean, COVID is interesting in terms of a slowdown because it is an example of something that rapidly accelerated, then slowed down and then fell, and now we're extremely interested in what happens next. I do have parts of the book which do talk about previous pandemics, where you have to go right back to the Black Death to find previous pandemics that actually resulted in long-term economic change. So the 1918, 1951, 57, 1968, 69 pandemics came and went without huge economic effect. But this time we were already slowing down when the pandemic hit. So I don't think many people think that the effects of this will really be that short term. And of course, we turned our economies off, which is very interesting.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to sort of stay to talk a little bit about activism and politics, really. So there are many people who in UK social sciences and social sciences in other countries that believe in value neutrality in social science research. We always see you as a very much a person who's got a very sort of activist streak within their work as well. So what are your current views on that sort of issue?
You're talking to me in the morning after Oriel College, Oxford, finally agreed that the statue will go. So it's interesting to, again, if you don't know what about this, the Statue of Rhodes, it's part of the shame of University of Working. No school in Oxford would have a statue of a racist on its wall, but for some reason, the University I'm working felt it was okay to have one. Everybody has political values. Anybody who tells you they don't are fooling themselves or trying to fool you. There is no such thing as value neutrality. Keeping silent is a political act, which is the thing that have been angering me recently in my university. Not a single head of an Oxford University college spoke out against the college publicly that had the racist statue. That's a political act. I just think we all have politics. I got this at the age of 18. I was taught political geography by Peter Taylor in Newcastle. And I'll remember this lecture to the day I die from Peter Taylor as an 18-year-old. And him saying, everything is political. Everything from how the rubbish on the streets is collected through to what kind of job you're going to end up in. There is nothing which is not political. And I guess he convinced me in that lecture.
Yeah, thank you. So your work is, I would say, you haven't read a lot of your work over the years. It's characterized by very detailed empirical work. And I wouldn't say, though, it was applied research. I wouldn't use that term, but I would describe it as locating in sociological terms, in terms of sort of R.K. Merton's middle range theory. So I would argue that your work tends to seek out empirical regularities. What sort of description, how would you describe it there?
I think that would be fair enough. It's kind of informed curiosity. I'm looking for things that might surprise people. And sort of by definition, if the thing I think will surprise people, the automatic reaction to something that surprises you is to not believe it, is to disbelieve it. So you then need a whole load of references and evidence to say, no, really, just, when I say inequality is falling, I can point to numerous things that do that. So I think I'm partly the last of an old breed of academics from an era where we didn't have to have theory chapters in our PhD, and we didn't actually have to say what methodology we were using, where we had a great deal more freedom than younger academics or PhD students have now, not to have to pigeonhole ourselves. And the other thing I should say is I was always very bad with words, even though I've written lots of books.
Right.
I wasn't good with words. Numbers I always found easy, and you do tend to gravitate to what it is you find easiest to do.
Okay, so can I steer the conversation then towards social theory? And I'd really like to know what your sort of position on the analytical value of the sort of what's sometimes called the grand theorists, and where some of the sort of insights or otherwise might be from the sort of post-linguistic turn, or whatever phrase people tend to use for it now.
Of these things, it's funny because you talk to people in English, in humanities, who will tell you, oh yes, we went through this 20 years earlier. Right. Social science, being slightly skeptical, but I'm not a fan of people trying to have grand theories. I happen to think that Karl Marx had a very, very good grand theory for his time, head and shoulders above anything before and after, but for his time, a new explanation of a new time that hadn't been done. But I think grand theories that hold a particular truth come along very, very rarely, and there's too much of a desperation of people trying to be the next one who does it. They're not quite as rare, but well, you can look at religions as grand theories. In World Mapper, I drew maps of 32 world religions, and each of those world religions, this World Mapper is a website of things around the world, each of those world religions had a grand theory at its start, its book of the truth. And interestingly, most of them were created at a time of turmoil and great inequality, when they were complaining about the inequality and the turmoil. And if you like, they're grand theories that had a huge effect. And I would put Marxism along that if you think about China and USSR and so on in terms of effect. And I just think there's a danger, if that's my idea of grand theory, there's a danger of so many people trying to emulate those kind of epoch-making things.
Okay. Yeah. So you've often, in your work, cautiously advised researchers to consider things that are not measured, as well as things that are measured. And in Slowdown, in the sort of Slowdown epoch, what new forms of data or data series would you like to see the UK, particularly the research and innovation, ESRC, UKRI and so on, funding in the next coming period?
Oh, things that are more personal about people's lives, their happiness, their well-being, their contentment, what they feel. Because we have got our standards living up to a certain level where there is no need for people to go cold, there's no need for people to go hungry, although, this week we had to see somebody argue that the Prime Minister would allow children to eat over the summer. But the next set of problems, the next set of big problems in the world, at least in affluent countries, are all about mental well-being, how satisfied you are with your life. Do you feel the need to go flying around the world to go on holiday to make yourself happy? Or can you be happier and feel secure and not feel precarious? That the Prince's Trust, the Prince of Charles has a trust, which I think since 2009 has done a survey on the mental well-being of young people in Britain. And this is hardly a radical trust, this is the Prince of Charles Trust. Every year, the level of anxiety amongst young people in Britain is reported as having risen by that trust. So that's the kind of thing I think we should be moving our resources more towards addressing, because it should be entirely possible to give younger people, of whom we've never had fewer young people. We've never given them a better education than we've given them now.
Yeah.
How on earth do you do those two things and then leave them in a state of acute anxiety?
Yeah, very good points. So I've noticed since lockdown, there's been a new cohort of amateur statisticians and data analysts emerging, particularly on TV and on social media. And I noticed lots of people are now drawing graphs and so on. Much of the data analysis in Slowdown is presented as timelines or graphs.
Yes.
What methodological insights can you offer regarding data visualization, not just for us as professional social scientists, but that new cohort of amateur social scientists that seem to be knocking around at the moment?
It is amazing, isn't it? It's really good news. I mean, a huge amount of credit has to be given to ONS. ONS went above and beyond in what they've released on this pandemic. Really took a series of decisions that were clearly internal, as no minister would have understood the complexities. And for 7,201 areas, ONS have told us how many people died every month in care homes. So they flooded the data out there to this army of armchair epidemiologists. Mm-hmm. And of course, all the standard epidemiologists, and also all of them are looking at COVID because it's new. Mm-hmm. And the great thing about this is that if there was anything to be seen, it will be found. And they've used the mass. I'm sure they didn't realise. And I'm sure what they did realise was how terrible this was. And they just put the information out there. I didn't think they realised that it would be used by such a wider set of people. So yes, for messages. So interestingly, I've been drawing with complicated diagrams, so the kind of having Slowdown on the pandemic, and these were very popular at first because they showed how much it exploded in 7 countries. But a few weeks ago, we kept on updating the graph, and it became more and more complicated. Yeah. And then the graph got attacked, I think, by the Financial Times as being far too complicated to understand. Right. And I quite like this because it was actually at the point when the pandemic was too complicated to understand. Right. And the graph that my friend Kirsty and I had produced showed this. It's now all heading down as I speak at the start of June. Methods, I mean, these are just timelines, but they're not much used in the West. That's a technique that comes from Japan I've been using. The only clever thing in the timelines I draw, which makes all the difference, is that I measure the rate of change from one period before, say a week before the date you're interested in, to the week after. And that produces such a different pattern and tells you so much more than measuring change at the precise point you're interested in. So in terms of the pandemic, we can see that it escalated upwards, did a series of loops in different countries, out of control and unpredictable, and then has come down more slowly than it's gone up, and again looped. And the looping is not due to reporting at weekends. It's something about COVID and a coronavirus pandemic, which is different from the influenza pandemics and the kind of thing I'm involved in later today. It's a great big researcher. Later today, we're plotting the comparisons with the 1951 flu pandemic with coronavirus, because part of the 1951 flu pandemic may not have been flu. It may possibly have been an early coronavirus. Sorry to go on about it, but please do. It's a way of looking at something. The 1951 pandemic killed far more people in somewhere like Liverpool than this has killed, and more people than 1957. But to see a pandemic nowadays, you can read the reports of it, but you can only really see it in the graphs and the numbers. And interestingly, in terms of qualitative, because we've just lived through this, we have some kind of feeling now. You can feel it in your gut. That looking at the same numbers a year ago, would have been so much more dispassionate. And I quite like having a passion. I do wish that. Well, I wish the pandemic hadn't happened. On the other hand, we've gone 50 years since another sharp up and down pandemic like this. It's been a long time since we'd had something quite as devastating as this, and it had to happen at some time.
So thank you. So Danny, I'm an advocate of transparent and reproducible research, and recently I heard you discuss the issue of sharing results and the particular problem of slow speed of peer review process. Would you like to tell us more about your thoughts in this area?
Yeah, I almost always put all the data I use up on the web, but I almost always use sources where I'm allowed to do that, or sort of allowed. Is other than mortality data, which I can't, individual records I mostly can't do.
Yeah.
It's not just, well, because you may make mistakes, so you want people to be able to reproduce it to see. It makes you much less likely to make a mistake if you if you know you're putting the data on the web. You know, you do an extra check, you haven't got it wrong.
Yeah.
And it's really easy to deal with requests for data. You just say it's there. You don't even have to ask me. You know, so it helps with that. Peer review's odd. It's the only thing we've got. We've just gone through this amazing experiment of seeing what happens without peer review. Sometimes several thousand papers a day being released on these preprint servers with this pandemic.
Yeah.
And you know, we have had papers peer reviewed in the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine that have been wrong. So I'm still in favour of peer review. I peer review 2 or 3 papers a week. I don't write many papers nowadays. It's a way of avoiding the researcher's embarrassment, I think. As much as, you know, look for where they've made an awful mistake. But my strongest views about this are that I do think preprints are brilliant and should go up. And I also think that referees' comments should go up on the web, because journal reviewing can be used as a process for frustrated academics to kind of get out their frustration about life. And there is a bit of bullying that goes on sometimes. And I think a bit more transparency there would be good. You see this more in medical journals, but you don't necessarily have to have the names released, but actually seeing the comments and then seeing the reply, and then seeing the referees reply to that, and eventually the paper goes up, I think is a much cleaner thing. Similar to how academics are appointed, say in Iceland or Finland or Norway, where all the CVs are on the web for everybody to see, which would be a bit of a shock in Britain. And all the assessors' reports on who should get the academic job, that's also public information as well. It sort of shows where the world, I think, is heading.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. So just to change track slightly, it's no secret my parents were early windrushers, and my father was a London taxi driver from 1964 to 2012. He was one of the first black men to pass the knowledge. And when I phone him up later and I say, Dad, he says, "What you've been doing today?" And I say, "Dad, I've been interviewing the Central Line guy." Is how he'll know you, the Central Line guy. He'll remember who you are then. So he'll say to me, "Did you question him on social inequality in the capital, you know, in London?" So I better get one question in that does that, Danny. So your book, if people don't know it, 32 Stops, that chronicled the lives of people living along the 32 stops of the Central Line, illustrated the extent and impact of social inequality in London. Which other tube lines would you have liked to have documented? Or do you have any plan? Yeah.
Oh, that's a great question. The first one I would have liked to have done was a lot of work. I did think of trying to walk the Central Line. Right. I worked out actually months if I was going to take any notice of what was around me on the walk.
Yeah.
I only walked Liverpool Street to Bethnal Green. That was long and interesting enough. The rest of the Central Line first, up towards Enfield and so on, and actually out of London.
And out Essex and
and a loop. Range Hill is up there. So that would be the first. That would be the first one to do, and then I think probably quite a posh one, the Metropolitan.
Right. Maybe,
just because you know, I'm a university professor now, so I have more in common with the lives of the kind of people who might be coming in from Amersham, and also I think that's the group of people whose views most need to change in future. The people who think that their wages that they're paid, who come in on that tube line, Oh, the other one would be from Waterloo into the city, that really fast little train packed with, packed with very angry bankers, is my impression of it. So I'm looking forward to be able to get back onto tube lines. You can tell I enjoy them. I consider being on the London Underground as a form of participant observation, and it's a much more pleasant experience if you think of it as research than if you think of it as, oh my God, how am I going to get from here to there in rush hour?
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. So your output over the last 30 years has been incredibly impressive, and I've heard you also say that you think British academics produce too much research output. What sort of advice do you have then for graduate students and early career researchers?
Yeah, I think I'm partly again a product of my times. My supervisor, Stan Openshaw, was incredibly prolific, one of the most prolific at the 1992 research assessment exercise. Later on, I've worked with lots of people, but Ron Johnson, most prolific geographer, and George David Smith in Bristol. It's been over 2,000 academic papers. So I was in a weird bubble of people and time where this kind of productivity was almost presented as normal. It's not. You could get rid of over half of what I've written. You could delete it from history and nothing would change. You know, half of what I have produced has had no impact, wasn't of much use. And so now, of course, it'd be very hard at the time to know what that half was. But I can absolutely tell you half could have gone, and then you could take another half of what's left and happily get rid of that. So the amount of time I could have had to have done other things, it's enormous. The world is full of journals now, full of articles, far too much for people to read. I really hope we're going to move towards two things. One is issues about quality and time, and back to where you might only write a few 2 or 3 journal articles in your lifetime. You know, discovered something about cuckoos that's really important, and you wanted to tell the world about cuckoos. And the other really important thing that will help this is having a flatter, less hierarchical structure in universities, moving them towards being a bit more like schools, seeing tertiary education as tertiary education, not an elevated separate thing for the higher orders, which is what it was. Now that over half of all young people go, you know, we don't expect school teachers to have research careers, even though a few in some of the elitist public schools do. I think the university academic in future to be a job where you can have a life as well and teach well. There should be a lot less emphasis on this absolutely enforced research, you know, almost like whipping people. Where's the new idea? You know, if the number of new ideas in the world is slowing down, well, what are we doing? Forcing people to write papers when they don't necessarily want to, and something new doesn't come up. I can't believe, I just find it impossible to believe that we will, in 10 or 20 years' time, be having research assessment exercises where we ask this enormous army of people around the world, where is your 4-star intergalactic research that has changed the course of the planet then? Without somebody just cracking up in laughter and going, oh, come on, stop it, it's stupid, you know, which, you know, it might be an irreverent view of the ref, but honestly, it's time to bring this one to an end, in my view. I know my colleagues, some of them like the ref, and the ref helped get rid of corrupt practices before, but it's been fun. I've enjoyed writing lots of things, but I do wish I'd had more time. There's a guitar behind me. I can't play it, you know. I do wish I'd written less and I could actually do things like play the guitar.
Okay, so thank you very much. So we're coming to the end of time. The final thing is my goddaughter Lola will be fantastically impressed when I tell her that I've been in conversation with a man who's met an internet time lord, which is we won't tell people any more about that. They'll have to go forward and read the book to find out what that actually means. So Professor Danny Dorling, thank you for being in conversation with us here at the National Research Methods Centre. Over to you for the final words.
Thank you ever so much for letting me talk about it in myself, and I'm so glad that I'd forgotten I'd written about the Time Lord. I did really meet him. I was about 21 at the time I met the Time Lord. That's all I'll say.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Danny Dorling, thank you very much.